The Sahara Desert, practically synonymous with desolation and death. Clocking in at 9.2 million square miles, it's larger than the entire United States or European Union. It's an enormous ocean of sand dunes and heat, and creates a barrier splitting Africa in two. However, a mere 6,000 years ago, this wasn't the case. The Sahara used to be wet, with most of it being grassland. Much of the Sahara's ecosystem would have reminded you of the savanna further south, with hippopotami, crocodiles, lions, and elephants inhabiting the region. The truth is that this theory is relatively recent, so no one's really sure why the Sahara went dry. However, most authorities believe that it was something to do with the long-term climactic changes with the monsoon in the region, so in this timeline the switch never takes place. Of course, all the climactic systems of the world are mixed together, meaning this, if the Sahara isn't dry, something else would change somewhere else in the world. But since I have almost no idea of what that would be, I can't really talk about it, so I'm just going to ignore it. So what if the Sahara stayed wet? What would the world be like? How would civilization develop? That is the question of this alternate history. This is a map of vegetation in the Sahara today. There's a large central desert, and to the north of it along the coast is the Mediterranean scrubland region, and to the south of it is varying degrees of non-desert, starting with grasslands and ending up with the forest. This is how the Sahara would look in this timeline. Keep in mind that I combined two schools of thought for this map, one in which saying that only the south of the Sahara was wetter, and one of which saying the entire Sahara was wetter. As you can see, the red desert has shrunk quite a bit, and most of what was the Sahara in our timeline is replaced by grassland. Also, the forest in the south has grown significantly, while along the north shore, the Mediterranean region has grown. You can probably see that there's more change in the south because that's where the monsoon was coming from, and far less change in the north. Also, lakes were far larger, with Lake Chad actually being larger than the Caspian Sea and several other large lakes. Now this is a river map of the region before the Sahara went dry. As you can see, there are many more rivers, with rivers being single rivers in our timeline actually becoming watersheds like the Nile, with many tributaries flowing into it. Let's look at what would happen region by region, starting with the desert and moving outwards. The desert would be inhabited much like the Sahara of our timeline, by nomadic desert tribes like the Tuareg of our timeline. The enormous new grasslands of this timeline would be inhabited by nomadic pastoral tribes like the Mongols that lived in Central Asia. They would have herds of sheep, goats, and cattle that would live off the grasslands and be wealthier than the desert tribes of our timeline. The Sahara doesn't have the tizi-tizi fly, which prevents the existence of horses in Africa further south, so that wouldn't be an issue. The nomadic steppe tribes are the nightmares of the civilized world. Every nomadic horse grassland culture has terrorized the neighboring sedentary peoples, with the most notable examples being the Central Asians, pumping out tribes like the Mongols, Turks, Kittens, or Huns, or the American Great Plains with tribes like the Sioux or Comanche. Desert tribes simply don't have the numbers, meanwhile, to terrorize the earth, and are far less successful conquerors, but some examples do exist like the Jews and Arabs. The Sahara did have some of this in our timeline, with the desert Berber tribes constantly invading the coast of North Africa and even Spain. It's just that they were far less successful at it than the horse tribes would be in this timeline. In this timeline, the grasslands of the Sahara would produce nomadic horse tribes that would terrorize North Africa, the sub-Saharan kingdoms like Mali and Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan, and even the Middle East and Southern Europe. This would transform the dynamic of the region in multiple ways. Firstly, the horse tribes would trade goods across the Sahara, thus making connections stronger between North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Secondly, it would make the Mediterranean a battleground for nomadic tribes. Let me put it this way. The Italians would have to worry about Rome being turned into a pile of skulls, and this would probably slow down the region's development. In our timeline, Egypt gained a very distinctive culture due to its geography. This was due to two main geographic variables. Firstly, Egypt was completely dependent upon the Nile. This was because the Nile River was the only source of water in the region, thus transforming what would be desert into fertile farmland. This also meant that Egyptian civilization could never leave the Nile and expand out into the desert, because it would lose its water. If you just look at a map of ancient Egypt, you can see the complete dependence. This dependence eventually screwed Egyptian civilization, since it was very attached to the land of Egypt itself, and so was never able to expand, thus meaning that it was crushed by civilizations like classical Greco-Roman or Middle Eastern culture, since they were able to expand from their home regions and grow much larger than Egyptian civilization. In this timeline, with the surrounding land being grassland, the Egyptian farmers would expand at least a bit outwards into the grasslands, making Egypt more of a real nation geographically. Also, in our timeline, Egypt was shaped by its complete isolation. In our timeline, Egypt was surrounded by desert on all three sides, and the ocean to the north. The only way Egypt could really be attacked before boats got big was from a narrow strip of land connecting it with Israel, and thus the Middle East, and from further up the Nile from Sudan and Ethiopia. But more often than not, the Egyptians were stronger and more advanced than the Sudanese, meaning that they could defeat them, thus meaning this was only a partial threat. This made Egyptian society very isolationist and conservative. The Egyptian armies were often far behind the rest of the Middle East, and Egypt would often collapse in on itself and ignore the rest of the world. Lack of contact with other cultures meant that Egyptian culture got stuck in its own ways very early and became impossibly conservative, being unable to deal with changing situations. This isolation and conservatism eventually screwed over Egypt for obvious reasons. In this timeline, this dynamic would be turned on its head. Instead of being surrounded on all sides by protection, Egypt would be surrounded by aggressive nomadic tribes with no natural protections like mountains or forests. To survive this, Egyptian civilization would have to become very militaristic and feudal. Egypt of this timeline would not be our timeline's fairly peaceful theocracy with loving gods, but a violent state run by warrior aristocrats and with violent and cruel gods. Egypt would become the Russia of this timeline, a nation on the edge of the steppe that had to become violent and expansionist to survive. This would, however, mean that Egypt would survive as a civilization, since the reasons it fell in our timeline would not exist. Under aggressive and militaristic leadership, they would expand across the region, settling in Sudan and moving into whatever you want to call the river delta in our timeline's Libya. The price for this expansion would be constant nomad attack and probably conquest. In our timeline to the west of Egypt, the North African coast was only habitable along a small strip along the coast before the desert began to take hold. This hurt this region quite a bit, with the north shore of the Mediterranean having 2 times the population as the south side, since the north side had a hinterland. In this timeline, things would be very different, with the land not immediately changing into desert, thus meaning that the land habitable for civilization would be larger. When the Phoenicians would arrive in the region, they would face a larger native Numidian population to resist them, but they would also have more land to settle. In our timeline, Carthage was very much a city-state, not really having much of a hinterland to pull on and instead relying off trade with other shores. This would not be the case in this timeline, with the Carthaginians being able to settle down as a large nation in North Africa. The big reason the Romans beat the Carthaginians was that the Romans simply had a much larger population, and Hannibal could defeat as many Roman armies as he wanted, but the Romans always had another army, kind of like how the sheer population and industry of America and Russia crushed the Axis in World War II. In this timeline, however, the Carthaginians with a large hinterland would have been able to keep control of their lands in the Punic Wars, with North Africa and Spain becoming part of the Carthaginian Empire. The Carthaginian Empire would probably spread a Punic civilization across the Numidian and North African tribes of the region, thus creating an alternate northwestern African civilization that would outlast the Carthaginian Empire if it fell at one point. In the Roman Empire in our timeline, North Africa was one of the wealthiest provinces, and with them still competing with the Carthaginians for the western Mediterranean, it would mean that the Roman Empire would be substantially weaker in this timeline. I don't know whether the Romans would still have conquered the Greeks and Celts, but we can be sure that in later years, Western civilization would be very different, with far more Germanic and Celtic influences, and far less Greco-Roman influences, that is, if Western civilization existed at all. Across the Sahara, there are the Sahel kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, and Darfur, nations most of you have probably only heard of from the Civilization series or accompanied with bad news. In our timeline, the Sahel kingdoms were in kind of a bad geographic place. They were sandwiched between the Sahara in the north and the tropical jungles in the south, in which horses died of sleeping sickness and disease became a major issue. This meant that the Sahel kingdoms always were a poor satellite of North Africa. I can hear all the Mansa Musa fanboys typing angrily saying he was the richest man in history. Firstly, I dispute that, with the sources for the website claiming it not being that good. In a world with people like Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great existing, I simply can't see it. But if you look at almost any other variable, be it religion, art, military, economy, etc., the Sahel kingdoms were always behind North Africa. In this timeline, the Sahel kingdoms with significantly more space to expand would be able to develop their own civilization along the lines of the West, China, or the Middle East instead of just being a satellite of North Africa. I really don't know enough about this region to say how it would develop, but I expect a lot of great religions, technologies, kingdoms, and art like every other civilization. In our timeline, empires like the Congo and Benin show that empires can develop in equatorial Africa, but still the lack of horses, geographic factors, and disease made developing an urban civilization difficult in equatorial Africa. However, with a dynamic Sahel civilization on their borders, tropical Africa would filter in technology like iron earlier, meaning it would be more advanced in general. This would mean that the scramble for Africa and other such similar events would never have taken place in this timeline. Maybe with tropical Africa moving faster developmentally, agricultural Bantu tribes that have migrated to Zimbabwe earlier, thus making Great Zimbabwe even greater, encompassing the entire South African region. I've basically created 4 new civilizations in this video. The truth, however, is that I have very little idea on how these civilizations are going to develop. If an alien had to travel back in time to the time of Christ and had to predict how the civilizations of the age would develop, he'd probably get it completely wrong, so I won't try that hard. In outline, I have to end this timeline thousands of years ago, but there are still a few things I can predict more recent than that. With the Phoenicians mainly being a naval power, we should expect the age of exploration to happen earlier, with the Phoenicians probably colonizing large regions of the world. With Egypt being a powerful civilization, it would probably suck Ethiopia into its orbit and might conquer the Middle East and Southern Europe a couple times. This would screw up the culture of the region, maybe with the cult of Isis replacing Christianity and Islam as the dominant axial age religions, but there's the butterfly effect creating issues with this. Speaking of the Abrahamic religions, having such a different Egypt and having the Abrahamic religion starting out with a tribe as weak and small as the Jews being dependent on Egyptian history means that the Abrahamic religions might not exist simply due to the butterfly effect. When gunpowder would make the horse tactics of the nomads irrelevant, the Sahelians, Egyptians, and Punics would divide up the Saharan grassland. The region with modern agriculture would likely become fertile agricultural land, like the Russian steppe, the South American pampas, or the North American prairie. I expect lots of bloody wars between the civilizations over control of this region in the industrial age. Africa in general will be far more important. In our timeline, Europe and Asia definitely led the world in technology and advancement for most of history, with North Africa kind of acting as a cameo. In this timeline, Africa would be equally important, thus changing the world balance quite a bit. With simply many more civilizations and people and far better connections across the Sahara, technology would be far more advanced in this timeline as well. Think of the advancements Sahelian, Carthaginian, and Egyptian artists and scientists would make. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next video. Thank you.